In the last video in this series, I built the wheels for the bandsaw. And in this one, I'm going to start off by showing how I made the quick release tensioner. And some of this has already been covered, especially in the first video. So it really makes sense to go back and watch that one if you missed it. What I'm making here is a cam lever that will actually apply the tension. It's just a piece of 1/2-inch plywood cut out into this shape. And it has a 5/8 inch hole that fits on the shaft that I glued in previously. The cam on the lever that I just made presses against a wedge, and because I have some, I'm going to be making mine from this white slippery plastic. This piece is 3/4 of an inch thick, so I'm cutting it down to 1/2 inch thick to begin with, and then I'm going to cut it at the correct angle. And the wedge fits into the angle cut on the upper wheel axle mounting block. With that much done, I can get a 1/4 inch blade on and see how it works. To increase the tension, you loosen the screws, slide the wedge over, and then tighten up the screws again. It looks good with a 1/4 inch blade. Now I've got a 1/2 inch blade I'm going to put on and try that as well. What I'm doing here is I'm checking how much the frame twists when you tension the blade. I've got a stick that extends down to where the table will be, and when I tension the blade, you can see it moves a very small amount. And I think I can improve that by adding some more structure on the upper part of the frame. The biggest reason for this happening is that there is a lot cut out on the upper part of the frame, and it's just 1/2 inch plywood, and all of that has an effect. So I'm going to start on the inside by adding a piece of 1/2 inch thick oak, and I'll do the same on the outside, except this piece is a lot bigger and it extends right over to the edge of the bandsaw. Another problem is the wooden spring that's kind of built into the frame is not stiff enough, so I'm going to bulk that up a bit by adding this piece right here. So I need to let the glue dry on that stuff, but in the meantime, I can shift my attention to the lower part of the bandsaw. I want to be able to get the motor on here, and I'm starting by making a permanent mark for the bearing block on the back. I also want to improve the grip that the stop collar has on the shaft by drilling a small hole for the set screw to fit into. Then I can get the belt put on and line up the motor so that I can mark where the bolts need to be to bolt it down to the base. Then I can get those drilled and countersunk from the bottom, and then put the bolts in with some hot melt glue to keep them from turning while I tighten the nuts. I also decided to replace the wood screws I had on the bearing block with machine screws and T-nuts, and that will improve how well this block stays in place without using those locking screws that I added in the last video. And then with that done, I can get the back plate put back on, get the stop collar put on, and put the motor in place and bolt it down. To put tension on the belt, I'm tapping the motor forward and then tightening up the nuts. And with the motor in place, I can start it for the first time and confirm that it's actually turning the right way. And this looks good. I also gave it a try with the blade on, and everything looks really good. After that, I completed the wiring, which really isn't that complicated. I cut a hole in the frame for the switch, wired up the switch, and organized the cables on the back. In the meantime, the glue did dry on the parts that I added to the top of the frame, and now I can finish the tensioner. The only thing left is something to hold it in place and keep it from coming off that shaft, but also something that I can remove if I need to do something with the lever. Next, I need to work on the trunnions for the table, and I'm making those from 3/4 inch plywood and using a very simple jig that works with my trim router to cut the half circle shapes to the right size. And rather than trying to clamp these parts down, I'm using my pin nailer. And because I need 3 of these, the pins will also allow me to put the part back in exactly the same place so that I can cut the adjustment slot after. Here's something I want to point out when you're using a circle cutting jig on your router like this. Before, when I was cutting through the full piece all the way through, like it had wood on every side of the bit, it really didn't matter which direction I went in. But here, where it's open on the bottom, you have to go in the right direction. Otherwise, when you reach that open area, the router will try to take off on you as it climbs into the cut. I have all 3 cut out, so I've reset my circle jig to cut the adjustment slot. And I'm doing this with a 1/2 inch bit because it's a 3/8 inch bolt that goes through it. The slot starts in a specific place and ends in a specific place, so I made a couple of marks on the plywood that will line up with the pivot block on the circle jig. I finished with the first one. Now I can take another one and put it in place. And like I said before, the pins allow me to line that up precisely. And with the adjustment slots cut in all 3, I can move on to making the cradle for the trunnions. And once again, that'll be 3/4 inch plywood that I'm cutting on my miter saw here. And I've had people ask me about what I'm doing here with the blade. I'm cutting in at the beginning and then I'm pulling it back kind of thing. It looks like I'm, trying to improve the cut. But in actual fact, I'm doing this because of the guard that's on my saw. It gets hooked on the wood otherwise. And then once again, I can pin those in place, being careful not to put it where I'm going to be doing the cutting. And with the circle jig for the router fine-tuned to exactly the right fit, I can cut all 3. So the cradles get attached to the lower part of the frame, and I'm using the trunnion by sighting in through that adjustment slot to the hole where the bolt will go to line it up. So there are 3 of those, and they get stacked up one on top of the other, trying to keep them in line as much as possible. And then to put together the trunnion itself, I'm going to do that in the cradle, laying in the first piece, then the second piece. Then I can pin those together and drive in screws from the other side. And the purpose of the trunnion is to keep the blade in the same place so that you don't have a big gap when you tilt the table. To make sure that the top of the trunnion is actually flat and square, I'm going to recut it. I've pinned on a scrap of plywood to go up against the fence, and I'm making a very slow cut here. And the reason why I'm going slow is to make sure that the blade is not deflecting sideways as I'm pushing the stock through. That will ensure that I'm getting the straightest cut possible. This piece of 1/2 inch plywood is to keep the trunnion tight up against the frame. Now I can move on to making the table, and that once again is 3/4 inch plywood. Cutting a bigger piece here down to 18 by 18 inches. So a pretty good sized table for a 12-inch saw. And what I'm doing here is cutting the miter slot. I figured that this would be the best way to do it on the table saw, making a series of cuts until I get to the right width, which is 3/4 of an inch. And this is something that I did on my previous bandsaw, the big one, And that's to make it so that a part of the table is removable so that I can access the lower blade guide and also change the blades easily. And to do that here, I'm making 2 stop cuts and a plunge cut where I wheel the blade up until it cuts all the way through. And then I need to cut a rabbet on the underside for the insert to fit into. So I'm using the trim router with a rabbeting bit. To make the insert, I'm going to try out my newly finished mini router table. I'm using that same rabbeting bit that I just used on the table to rabbet the edge of the insert to the right depth. And I had to do this in several passes, especially at the end where I really snuck up on a perfect fit to get it exactly flush on the top. But when I put it in place, I could see my mistake. I made it too short. So another piece of scrap plywood. Cut another one and start over. Except this time, I'll be sure to mark it the right length. I also need to add cleats to the underside to keep the insert in place. These are just strips of 1/4-inch plywood that are being held by number 5 screws. Then I can take the table and line it up where it needs to go on the trunnion and screw it down to the trunnion. And I'm using 4 2-inch screws to do that. So this is actually the first official cut where I cut the slot in the insert for the blade. And even though there aren't any blade guides on here, I thought I would make a wavy cut in 1-inch thick ash. That looks really good, and it felt pretty good too. We've got one more video to go in this build, and that'll be making the blade guides and also the front cover. So if you're not subscribed already, you might want to do that so that you don't miss it.